Hello and welcome. My name is Delmico L. Cunningham, your instructor for the Intro to 3D Studio Max. So in this video series, what we're going to be talking about are some of the best practices for modeling and rendering inside of Autodesk 3D Studio Max. So first things first, let's get a little bit familiar with the interface of 3D Studio Max. So first of all, when you first open up Max, you're presented with a quad menu system. So right now you can see our quad menu is actually active. And my quad menu, or my quad viewport rather, not menu, but viewport, I have my top view, front, left, and perspective view. Now, first thing we want to realize is how do we navigate these viewpoints? So how do we navigate these spaces? So if I hold down my Alt key on my keyboard and I use my middle mouse button, you'll see it allows me to orbit my center of interest. Now if I hold down Control and Alt and middle mouse, it allows me to zoom in and out or dolly in and out on my scene. Alright. Now if I come in here and I just use my Control key and middle mouse, it lets me pan my camera around. Alright. Let's just turn this off real quick. So Control Alt and middle mouse lets me dolly the camera in and out. Alt and middle mouse lets me orbit the camera, and then Control and middle mouse lets me pan the camera. Alright. I can always hit Z on my keyboard, so if I hit Z, that is zoom extends. So it kind of frames up everything in my scene, which is actually really nice. Because when I've moved stuff around, I can just hit Z and reframe my view. Now, this right here, my perspective viewport, is just that. It's a perspective assignment of a view. So one thing that I can do here inside of Max is I can also move around in these other viewports. Now these other three viewports rather, these are orthographic viewports, meaning that they are 90 degrees towards the picture plane. So the controls are actually very similar. If I hold down the Alt key and try to move, you'll see something goes really weird, right? You'll see that it changed from being my front view to being orthographic. You never want to try to rotate one of your orthographic views. If you do that, it'll throw you into orthographic perspective, which is a perspective that is kind of compressed space. So it doesn't show true perspective inside of an orthographic perspective view. Now, one thing that I can do inside of my orthographic views, I can hold down the Control key and actually move or pan my view around, or I can hold my Alt, Control, and middle mouse and actually zoom in and out or dolly in and out onto my orthographic view. Now, if you have a mouse wheel, your mouse wheel does the exact same thing. So if you have a mouse wheel, it'll actually dolly in and out for you. So you don't have to hold the Control Alt to do that. But if you just hold the Control key down, that lets you pan around and see your view. And remember, you can always hit Z to zoom extend, and that'll bring everything back into focus. So, other things inside of the interface. Now, Autodesk 3D Studio Max is really meant to be a digital content creation package. What that means is that it can create, animate, you can rig in here, you can light in here, you can even do some basic compositing things inside of here. So this is really meant to be an all-around digital content creation piece of software, which is great. It's very much like Autodesk Maya as well as Autodesk Softimage. And to all the users of Softimage, I have to give you a hearty condolences, as I know that this is actually the last year that Softimage will be made by Autodesk. They are discontinuing the use of Softimage after this year. So we want to say goodbye to a really great program in the 3D world, and kind of wish it had kept going, but it's been a long time coming. But anyway, back to Autodesk 3DSMAX. So here inside of Max, we've realized and we learned how we can actually manipulate our viewports and be able to move around inside of our viewports. The other thing that we want to pay very close attention to is that one, we have on the right hand side over here this panel. This is called the command panel. So this command panel has all of the functions, or at least most of the functions that you'll use throughout your lighting, modeling, and rigging, and setting up cameras. All those things, dynamics, all can be done from right here. Now, the thing that's very interesting about Max is that the stuff that's here in the command panel is also up here in the toolbar. And then once again, if we look just one more time in here, a lot of these pieces, let me put this guy back up here in its ribbon form, but a lot of these pieces that make up Max are kind of all over the place. It's a little bit weird. But it kind of is what it is. Max has evolved and changed over the years, and so things have become a little bit redundant inside of Max. And that's kind of unfortunate sometimes. It can get a little confusing. So on this right-hand side, we have the command panel, and across the very top up here, and if you'll see, I hit this little minimize panels right here. These are what are considered to be ribbons. So these are ribbons. When I click this open, it opens up a ribbon. And if you've used like Microsoft Office, you might be very familiar with the whole idea of having a toolbar ribbon that has these, functions that you use most of the time that you can quickly access and get to. We'll be looking at more of the ribbons in later videos. So right across the other part of the top here, I have my toolbar here, and it has a couple of different functions and things on it that I'll use quite a bit. Everything from render setup to actually my render button. Some animation things are up here, as well as my snaps, and these let me snap to various ways. I can snap to the grid in various ways. I can also link and unlink items up here and bind things to space warps. Also my selection. Now, one thing that I want to make you aware of is this. Sometimes in a lot of programs you'll hit, and if you're used to using Maya, you'll usually hit Q to end process for a particular tool. Now inside of Max you still can do that. You still can hit Q to end process, but what that does, Q is also bound to a selection key. So up here when you see this right here, this rectangular selection region, when I hit Q, you'll see it becomes a circular one. If I hit Q again, then it's like a polygon tool inside of Photoshop. If I hit it again, then I get this lasso selection tool, and then I get this paint selection tool. So when you go to select something, like you'll see now, when I go to select something, it gives me a circle. And if you're hitting Q in between, that's why. That's why it's changing how you select things. So this right here is like kind of like in Photoshop where you have the lasso tool where you can lasso around a selection and then make a selection. And same thing here. I get this circular where I can make this circular selection, hit Q again, and I can actually get a spray bottle, kind of like a paint can, and spray over my selection of what I want to select. So it's very useful, but it can be very frustrating when you hit Q and then you're like, well, my selection type has changed. That's why. If you keep hitting Q, it's going to cycle through all the different selection types. Now, the other thing about Max, when we're looking at this and starting off with this, like I've told you, everything that you want can be found here inside of the command panel. So this whole section over here is your command panel. Now the command panel is broken up into kind of categories and subcategories. So the very first thing in here, it looks like a little sun. That's my create panel. The next panel is my modify panel. The next panel is my hierarchy panel. And then my motion panel. And then my display. And of course my utilities panel are all in here. Now if I go back to my create panel really quick, you can see in my create panel it only shows me sub-object things that I can create. So I can create geometry, I can create shapes, I can create lights, cameras, helpers, space warps, and systems. So if I come here to geometry, you'll see it says standard primitives, right? So it shows me like box, cone, sphere, geosphere, cylinder, tube. So these are realistically basic primitives that you could think about when you think about something, a geometric shape of something. These are as basic as you get. Now if I come to this drop down, you can see I have extended primitives, I have compound objects. So each one of these might have some other stuff inside of it. So right here, if I go to shapes, you can see I can do splines, which are basically 2D shapes that I can use to actually model with. I can go do lights, and I've got photometric lights, standard lights. Now, some things that I have in my menus you probably will not have. Currently, I use a different renderer inside of Max called Vray, and Vray has its own lighting system and lights. So that's why I have this Vray tab in here. So when you're looking at your version of Max and you don't have that tab, don't freak out. It just means that you do not own Vray, because Vray is a separate plugin that you can purchase for 3D Studio Max. And it's a renderer. It's a really great renderer actually too. We will not be using Vray in these videos and in this workflow. Where we'll only be using things that are available directly to every user of 3D Studio Max. So we will be using Mental Ray as our main rendering engine. Okay. So here inside of my create, I can also create cameras. I can create helpers, which are dummy objects or grids or tape measures or protractor or a compass or whatever I need to. And then I have space warps and then also systems. The next panel in here is I have my modify panel. My modify panel is how I actually modify. Once I have like a primitive or something to modify, then I can come to my modify panel and I'll have a whole list of, modifiers that can actually do things to my model. And since I don't have anything inside of my scene right now, there's nothing to modify. So the other thing I have is my hierarchy panel. So I can make adjustments to hierarchy. So I can change the pivot point of objects. I can, affect the pivot point of an object or affect the hierarchy of an object. So this comes into play more when you're doing parenting or you're trying to set up items that have specific pivot points and centers of action and centers of mass. You can change those things right here inside of the hierarchy panel. And then the next panel is my motion panel. And this is really used more towards when you're doing things with animation. Once again, if I had a object inside of my scene, I would have some modifiers as far as motion that I could apply. But since I have nothing in my scene, there's nothing that shows up for my modifiers for my motion. The next thing is my display. So this is kind of the things that are being shown in your viewport. So if you can see, if I actually had some geometry in my viewport, you can see this says hide by category. So I could just click on this and hide all the geometry that I had inside of my scene, or hide all the shapes, or all the lights, or cameras, or helpers, or whatever. So this is a quick way to actually get through your scene and be able to hide or display what you want, and then hide other things that are kind of in the way. So it's really about keeping things organized. Now, if you're a Maya user, if you come from the world of Maya, then this is very akin to how the outliner works for Maya. So, there's a direct correlation between these programs. And as I try to tell students, it doesn't matter what 3D program you're using. You can use 3D Studio Max, you can use Maya, you can use Softimage, you can use Houdini, you could use Blender, you could be using, Cinema 4D, and the list goes on and on. Realistically, the thing about it is that as a modeler and as a 3D artist in general, you need to understand the basic parameters of how to manipulate these objects, because realistically, it doesn't matter what program you use. For the most part, it does not matter what program you use to model something in. But if you don't know how to model, if you don't know the techniques of modeling, then it doesn't matter what program you use, it's not going to make you model any better. So realistically, I try to tell students that we're not learning software, we're learning technique. So it comes down to understanding the techniques that you're learning and not just the software. Because for me personally, I am a Maya baby. So I've used Maya for 15 plus years. That's my main program. I love Maya, but that doesn't mean that I cannot use 3D Studio Max. I'm also very proficient inside of Max. It's just another tool that I use. And Max does some things really well, and Maya does some things, a lot better in certain ways. And there's strengths and weaknesses to both programs. So never let anyone try to, persuade you that the program makes the modeler, or the artist, because realistically the program is just a tool. So let's recap what we've gone over here in this lesson. One, we've looked at our different types of viewports. We actually have 4 viewports when we first open this up. We have our left, top, front, and perspective. We've also talked about how to navigate inside of our viewports. Remember, the Alt key and my middle mouse button allows me to orbit my camera. The Control Alt and middle mouse lets me dolly my camera in and out. And then Control and middle mouse lets me pan my camera. So the same thing inside of my orthographic viewport. If I hold down the Control key and middle mouse click, I can pan my camera. And if I hold out Control Alt and middle mouse click, I can actually dolly or zoom my camera in and out. So that is a quick introduction to the interface of Max. And in our next lesson, we're going to look at what we're going to be completing here inside of Max for our very first project, which is going to be a still life right here inside of Max. So stay tuned for our next lesson.